next leadership meeting? Is it next Friday? Or next Thursday?
The 31st or Friday. So I have it for the 31st.
Okay, so Wednesday, we'll do it, I'm sorry.
Ah,
We'll see if you're out. Oh.
Good evening to members of the public. We would like to resume our board meeting in terms of an open public session. Prior to the meeting, we had an executive session. First half was a board retreat where we discussed processes related to superintendent evaluation and communications with members of the public. And then we also discussed a confidential personnel matter to close the executive session. At this point, we would like to go and do our Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, one announcement, Mr. Gilbert could not be here due to a work commitment. So at this point, we'd like to adopt an agenda. Can I have a motion? Mr. Rajat, second. Mr. Delalo, any comments, questions? If not, all in favor? Okay. And at this point, we're going to go into a study session. It's designed for the purpose of administrative updates to the Board of Education. No public comments during this time. Residents may attend the next scheduled meeting on the February 5th and or contact the board by email at boe@shenet.org with any comments or questions. All questions come in the Office of Public Information Officer and are shared with the board and or superintendent as appropriate. Policy questions, concerns are typically addressed by the board president. Operational questions are typically addressed by superintendent and or designee. So at this point, I'll turn over to Dr. Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Presley. So I'd actually, if you don't mind, just go into the study session items. The first item we have is budget roadshow schedule. We're in the process of budget development right now, and a big part of the budget development, let me just enlarge this a little bit, is communication with the public. So it's kind of a multi-phase process for the board. So this is the internal phase of the process that started actually in October and will run until about February. Then we start having public discussions at board meetings about respective components of the budget. And the board will adopt the budget that will go to the public referendum. And so once the board adopts the budget in March, we start what we call a budget roadshow to tell the public what's in the budget for the May vote. As you see here, I want to surely highlight all of them, but we start with the formal adoption of the notice at the end of March, and then we start everything such as talking to our respective union leadership about what's in the budget, how the budget may impact the coming year. So in turn, that they're talking to employee members of the respective unions. So a big part of it is to eliminate the I didn't know, and therefore I can't be an ambassador for some of the things the school district's doing. And we have a lot of faculty meetings. The town of Clifton Park, we go to the town of Clifton Park, transportation staff, we have community conversations, PTA meetings, try to hit all the PTA meetings. Some cases, because of timing of certain PTA meetings, we can't get to certain PTA meetings. Between myself, the KWC is Mrs. Kathy Wetmore Chase, we split. So sometime I'm at one, she's another. We're always running, as you see. We have a lot of time out at different functions. The half moon town board meeting is typically a 2 o'clock one, which serves a great opportunity because also the day that meeting they do a special recognition for their senior citizens. So there's typically a large meeting with a couple hundred people, so it's a great opportunity for us to talk about the budget. So you see, again, a wide variety of places we try to discuss the budget, both internal and external, all leading up to the May vote, which this year will be Tuesday the 21st. So this schedule, we're still waiting for some few dates to finalize. But once it's up, we put out on the website so people know that if you want to come and hear about the budget, you could always welcome to attend any of these meetings, particularly the outside meetings such as the town of Clifton Park and the town of Half Moon board meeting. So that's where we are right now. Certainly the board would have that schedule. Related to this, somewhat related to this, in fact, I'll go to the next piece. Before I go to the next piece, any questions from the board. You've seen the schedule before, so the roadshow is there. We're out probably 4 nights a week talking to someone somewhere about the budget. So it's a great opportunity to engage the public in conversation. Related to the budget, and I don't have a slide, is just this past week, the governor, how the state budget process works. It's a 4-phase process, if you will. The executive budget, which is the governor's budget. The governor typically comes out by mid-June with the governor's budget. How the laws are written in New York State, the governor, quite frankly, which would dictate quite a bit because he could write into the budget certain language that the only way that the Assembly or the Senate can get out is to, quite frankly, just shut down the state, and which is an interesting maneuver that has. And so what it does is puts the governor in a power position in relationship to the Assembly and the Senate. This year is particularly interesting because for the first time in decades, you have all Democratic control. The governorship, the executive branch, the Assembly, and the Senate. So all 3 houses, so to speak, are Democratic control. So the question then is, are we going to see the type of power play that we've seen in the past? In the past, you'll see the governor will come in at budget here, the Senate will come in somewhere here, and the Assembly will come in slightly higher. So this case, when they're all Democratic, the Senate has been largely Republican controlled in the past, and the Assembly has been largely Democratic controlled in the past. New York City dominated Assembly, Long Island dominated Senate. Upstate New York, quite frankly, we haven't had really strong representation in a long time, and so a lot of the conversations in the budget process, we're always trying to figure out who do we try to influence to have a, when I say upstate, so there's upstate New York and then there's Buffalo. So you know, people say upstate, I'm thinking more the capital region, Adirondack region. They have Western New York has a whole different flavor to it as well. So we look at this. So the governor's budget proposal for education actually came in very lean in comparison to what people were expecting from a supporting finances for the state. So the conversation now is, where is the Senate and the Assembly? Will they come in? Anticipate they'll come in higher than where the governor is. The question is, how much higher? And for us, as Shen specifically, our big financial focus is on what we call the foundation aid, which for us doesn't generate a lot of money, but certainly makes a big difference in that generation of money. So the governor's proposal, for instance, says that every school district should get minimally 0.25, a quarter of a percent increase. So put in perspective, we have $170 million plus $1 million budget. A quarter of a percentage on state aid increase would be about $70,000. We spent $70,000 cleaning the campus over the snowfall to get ready for school over the past 3 days. So I just put context is very important. And so for us right now, the governor's state aid proposals for us is pretty flatline for all intents and purposes. So as we start to advocate with the legislature, one of the things we spoke about an advocacy position last board meeting was foundation aid formula, looking at that formula saying the state has to do a better job of funding, providing this foundation aid for school districts. And I've said it for the past 10 years, Shen is in a unique, interesting position. We're too rich to be poor, and we're too poor to be rich. And so in this region, capital region largely, people look at a district like Shen and say, well, Shen is a quote-unquote wealthy district. You take Shen in comparison to really wealthy districts, particularly Long Island, some of those places, we're all of a sudden become the stepchild in that equation. So it's a relative thing. So are we relatively wealthy in comparison to some of our poor rural communities? Yes. So it's a relative thing. So this formula is supposed to regulate that wealth so that a poor rural community don't have a situation like what most poor rural communities have now, where they can't offer certain courses because they don't have the funding. In some cases, they don't have anyone who wants to come to those communities to teach certain courses. So they get the double whammy of who wants to work in and who has the funds to pay for. And a community like Shen, where over the past several years, we've been doing a lot of things to control our fiscal destiny. So we're not having this huge reliance on where the state is coming in on their budget. So as we go through the budget development process now, we go through the budget development process almost in a worst-case scenario. Worst-case scenario, if we don't get a single penny more from the state, what's the tax implication, and how do we try to minimize that tax implication and without cutting, reducing programs? So we start there in a very conservative way, and then say where does opportunities lend ourselves to expand programs as we move forward. So the governor's budget, as I articulated to you quite a bit in the Friday Bulletin, won't necessarily rehash all those details, was way more conservative than most people anticipated. However, I think it's a part of, okay, well, I'm not going to be the one to shoot high when when it's a democratically controlled House, someone else has to come in with that piece of it. Before I pause and allow for the board question, the one positive aspect this year, the chair of the Education Committee in the Senate is a former teacher that's now a state senator. The chair of the Assembly Education Committee is a former teacher. So for the first time in a long time anyway, we have two former educators that are now politicians who are chairing those education subcommittees. So minimally, they understand the lingo and understand some of the unique aspects of schools other than the simple black and white, how much money we spending for education versus those kind of things. Because one of the things that the governor is harping on is that, well, it's not an issue of schools not having enough money. They just don't distribute the money correctly within their schools. And so I'll give you for a perfect example. If we look at and we did this presentation to the board. We looked at equity across our schools. And you can have a school that, by the function of the types of program in it, that school probably costs more to operate than another school. But it's not saying that we're shortchanging the other school. We're just simply saying this school costs more to operate because we have specialized programs. And we have that in Shen. We have school buildings that have specialized programs that costs more than other school buildings. So someone would look at those two places and saying, hey, this school is getting way more money for its kids. Well, yes, you're correct. But if we start looking at how the funds within that school is expended, and you take out the exceptions and compare the commonalities, you realize that you have much more parity. So the governor has been on this whole, it's local districts have to make better decision kind of approach to things, which is, quite frankly, with you, David Little and Gary shared it with Mr. Delano shared it with me. David Little is an expert in this stuff. He wrote a great analysis of it. It's the whole smoke and mirror distraction conversation versus, okay, we can sit here and parse out the pieces, but the reality of it is we still don't have enough in the whole. So let's talk about the whole before we start trying to play this piece against each other. So needless to say, the process this year is going to be a little bit interesting. The legislative process is going to be a little bit interesting because that's the governor's angle. And so the question is, we're watching to see where the assembly is going to come from. Right now, we come right after MLK holidays, so they're all coming, recalibrating, going back into session. So next week and a half, we'll see where the assembly is going to start talking, where the Senate is going to start talking, and where it's going to impact us on our budget piece of it, because we're pretty flatlined from a state funding formula perspective right now. So therefore, any potential addition of beyond will have some financial implication, but we have a history as a district that our tax impact has been pretty minimal over the past several years, and that's our expectation going into the budget as well for 1920. So I'll stop there in case there are questions. I know Mr. Delano may have a few questions or comments.
I know that the governor, one of the other things that the governor is doing other than general aid is trying to combine all of the expense-based aid into one aid formula and then capping it at 2%. And when you're talking about transportation and some of our other aids that grow at a rate generally at a higher than that, this would be very detrimental to us in terms of revenue that's coming in. Allegedly, he has $125 million built into the budget that is not allocated, which will allow him to grow the education budget or any other segment of the budget that he wants without actually affecting the bottom line. So that's good. That's good. But this very week, they're voting on making the tax levy cap permanent. And normally, this is interesting, I haven't heard any ripples about downstate lobbying to hook that to rent controls down in Manhattan, which they normally do. But if they're pushing this fast, it makes it impossible for us to try to use some kind of bargaining chip in there to say, okay, you make it permanent, but it's got to be 2%. It can't be adjusted by the cost of living. Or if you're going to make it 2%, let's make the override procedure the same for all governmental entities, and that is instead of we have to go for 60% of our vote to get an override, and all they have to do is get 60% of the governmental body to say that they want to override, and it happens. There has to be some consistency there. He's going to be, in another area of the budget, he's going to be under a lot of pressure from municipalities and counties because Medicaid has been cut substantially, hundreds of thousands of dollars in many instances, at a time when there's an argument that this should be passed to the state from the county. He's shifting it to the county.
Well,
And
the global cap, he actually expanded this year. So he, in the state of New York, to match more of the affordable health care, he's actually expanded the global cap and put more money into it, which the Medicaid, which we will flourish in New York State as versus affordable health care nationally.
Okay.
So, yeah.
But he has actually cut the amount of money that goes to the individual entities,
Counties, the DSS?
the county, et cetera, by, as I say, by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they're very much concerned with that. And it looks like, what it looks like, aside from trying to shift the argument from where the money goes within the school district, that's what he's trying to do, away from the settlement for CFE, the case,
Fiscal equity.
I can't come up with it. But anyway, it had to do with equitable aid. You know, the state is something like $4 billion short of adequately aiding the people. He wants to say, oh, that doesn't count anymore. That's old hat. Let's look at this. So this is just a disruption of the process of really thinking about it in terms of what we've been talking about all along. And so we've got a lot of work to do. Hopefully we can actually work with our legislators and get them to do something realistic for us. Campaign for fiscal equity.
So, needless to say, it's going to be an interesting dynamic because you don't have a countering side perspective.
Can I ask one thing about the tax cap? So last year, it was on the table about taking the rights away from the individual districts as far as voting on their budget?
No.
That's not, that's, okay.
We wouldn't.
Just want to make sure
No.
that that's not where they're going with making it.
No, basically, every year there's a formula based on the consumer price index, and it's typically December CPI, and then that formula goes in to dictate what that tax cap. This one that we'll be using, ironically, for 1920 is actually right at 2%. And so that goes into this elaborate formula that we use then to dictate what's the cap on your tax levy. And if you recall, we have yet to maximize our tax cap levy, because as a school district, we've been, quite frank with you, we've been very efficient, effective in our budgeting process. So, and while that's good for us, one of the things that we can't get caught in the trap of, well, it may not hurt us today, well, it may hurt us tomorrow, but more importantly, if it's hurting our neighbors, we all have to have a voice. And I think that's a societal thing that sometimes we don't do. It's not my problem, my neighbor's problem. Well, you know, it's a recession until when it's your neighbors, a depression when it's you. And so that's the thing we have to watch very closely. But last comment on this, that to explain a little bit Mr. Delato's comment about expenditure-driven aids. So some of our largest expenditures in the district, things like transportation, things like BOCES services, things like textbooks. We basically, what we spend one year, we are reimbursed at a formula next year. And so if we spend more, you get reimbursed more. If you spend less, you get reimbursed less. Logical. This cap wants to put all these in and say, well, we don't care what you spend, we're only going to give you this incremental piece of it. So some may see it as good or bad because it provides greater flexibility, but the reality of it is all these expenditures, one thing not necessarily contingent upon one thing. In other words, I don't want to sit here and say, well, because we want to purchase another bus or do something that's trans, we're not going to buy books this year. That's what this would kind of do versus keeping things separate and looking at those expenditure categories separately. So it's an interesting dynamics that's happening right now. And so when we start lobbying and Mrs. Ford sent out dates, we're going to go down. And so by then we would have hopefully heard where the cracks are in the argument and be able to pinpoint some things that's beneficial, first and foremost, to Shen and the Shen community. And secondly, to how do we try to also influence for the larger good education across New York State. So more to come on that piece of it. I just want to give you a flavor of that. Right now, the news, so you can kind of say, well, it wasn't bad news, it was neutral. Well, depends on perspective, right? Negative, 0, plus. Depends on where you are. So right now we're kind of at 0. We're not at negative, but we're not at plus neither, because what's being proposed to us is pretty flat line for Shen. So more to come on that. Let me continue. So the third piece I have here for under me, and again, I won't go through the entire document. It's a 40-plus page, 47-page document, so I won't go through it. I know that some board members have in detail. Thank you, Mrs. Hoffman, and shared some thoughts with me already. So since 1994, it has been a state law for schools to have shared decision-making as a part of the process. Here at Shen, we call them partnership teams. So people may hear the word partnership teams, high school partnership team. So we have all these partnership teams. Board members serve on those partnership teams. We have community members, we have teachers, we have students, depending on what grade levels. So this plan, every 2 years, by law, by education law, we have to update this plan. And so this is that part where we update the plan now. And so I'm just going to highlight that. So we made some changes. One of the things that we always have to update in the plan is make sure that our mission statements, our values and beliefs, our profile, all those things are up to date. And so a big part of the change in the plan was to, in fact, update those goals and put our new goals and some of the essential objectives in that plan, knowing that in another 18 months we'll be updating the plan again. So if we're making the changes to that, we'll do so. So this first section was probably where most of the changes occurred. One neat section in the plan that's pretty. One plan talks about involving the stakeholders. So it's I hate to say it, it's hard to get people like Cameron. And I say like Cameron because here's a young man, junior in high school? Sophomore, my God, even more impressive. Who not only volunteered to be a student member on the Shen School Board, but also volunteered to be a student member on the Shen Foundation Board. It's hard to get people to volunteer time. And so while we have this plan that talks about stakeholder involvement, to getting stakeholders to get involved is a chore. And so a big part of this push is to how do we let people know that, you should have an interest in what's happening, and here's one way to be a part of your partnership team, your school partnership team, talk about what's happening within your school environment, some of those kind of things that impact the day-to-day quality of life, if you will, for student and staff. So the plan speaks to that, talks about accountability for results, and also talks about the types of decisions. So there are certain decisions that a partnership team will give information to, but they're not making the decision. And because at the end of the day, there's an accountability. As superintendent, I'm accountable for certain decisions. I can't say, hey, Mrs. So-and-so, won't you make a decision? Well, that person doesn't have the authority nor the expected accountability for it. So this plan also talks about the types of decisions that are input is gathered and ultimately who makes those decisions, because it becomes important to say that, because oftentimes people think that, well, if you didn't use my input, you didn't agree with me. Well, maybe your input was good, but your input wasn't the most relevant for the decision that we're making, but your input probably influenced ultimately how we thought about that or something else. And so the process talks about those kind of things. So it's a pretty comprehensive plan. And so we updated it, we sent it out. And one of the things that I'm going to make an emphasis after tonight when the board adopts is, when I send it to my colleagues at the development level, to make sure that they walk through this plan with their respective partnership teams. I'm pretty confident most do, but I want to make sure that they do it right now while it's fresh. And secondly, as is pointed out by a board member, when we do our board orientation, to also have this as one of the documents that we share with new board members who serve on partnership teams, to say, here's the expectation. Do we follow this 110% to the letter of law? We would all love to, but some cases you don't have the capacity to because you don't have enough people, you don't have enough this and those kind of things. But just give that framework to how we approach it as well. So again, I'm not going to go to the document. The board had it in advance to look at, and once it's adopted, we'll send it out to respective partnership team for them to share it out. The document lives in board policy, by the way. This is a board policy, so it's not something that's an aside. It's a part of a board policy, so it always lives on a website in the board policy section. Any questions on that?
Just some observations from me is I've seen some cases from some respective school partnership teams have scored a home run. You know, in high school, I've been very impressed with what they do. The surveys at the end of the year. In the past, I think we've done some surveys around Thanksgiving for recent graduates, maybe not this year, but the ability to get students to spend their gym period, seniors at the end of their gym period at the end of the year, or during a gym period at the end of the year, to fill out a detailed survey has created a lot of the signals that have led to things where we've taken board action. It definitely led to some of the enhancements to counseling over the last couple of years, bringing more financial management into economics classes, because a lot of students will say, I don't understand financial management. I'm leaving Shen without getting that. And so there is great feedback coming in. I've seen other schools whereby March and April, no one shows up because it's just everybody's doing other stuff, and they miss an opportunity. So in many cases, the schools that can't get around to having an energetic partnership team, and it is a partnership, you do need parents there, you need students there, maybe not so on the elementary side, but you definitely do need students, and we'd love to see some elementary students participate, but they're hard to bring into a meeting like that. But we have missed opportunities, and I think that needs to be understood, that if schools aren't able to do it, you're missing a chance to really get better. I think your comment that it's not getting enough volunteers is probably hitting the nail right on the head. A lot of times people just don't know, or they just are too busy, but that's the penalty is you miss an opportunity. That's all for me.
Okay. So I hope that you'll adopt it tonight, and we'll start distributing accordingly. So we have one other presentation, then the last piece I'll turn over to Mr. Delalo to introduce. Dr. Wood will talk about some upcoming IPACK initiatives that...
Thank you. So you have in your packet the memo that outlines IPACK course recommendations. IPACK is the Instructional Planning Advisory Council that is made up of teachers and administrators and board members and students that reviews changes to our program of studies. So this year, there are 3 areas that we have looked at and are bringing forward to the board, recommending changes to the program of studies as a result of a careful review, not just from, it usually starts with the department and goes through the academic leaders of the department, comes to Dr. Robinson and me, and usually Ron Agostinotti, the high school principal. We talk about the merits, and then when there is sufficient interest and it plays itself out to be a positive enhancement that can be supported, it then goes to IPACK. IPACK has proven to be a very useful committee in that we have multiple perspectives kind of wrestling with the proposed changes, considering what is going to be make a positive enhancement and lead to a positive outcome for our students. I want to recognize the fact that Mrs. Hoffman and Mrs. Rajat represent the Board of Education on IPACK and are there firsthand to hear the discussion. There were 3 areas specifically that we looked at this year. The first being American Studies. And this is an area we spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about. Mrs. Sherwin is here on behalf of the English department because American Studies is an interdisciplinary course, social studies and English, and it is an 11th grade, basically double period, where students can earn their English, 11th grade English, and their 11th grade social studies. Up to this point, students have been able to elect to do extra work to get an honors credential or an honors option. And we've had this in place for many years. The reality is, I'm going to say at least as long as Mrs. Sherwin has been here and at least as long as I've been in the current position at district office, we've been hearing challenges about this particular course. An honors course is not designed to simply be an additional amount of work on students, where they sit shoulder to shoulder and then have the same basic instruction day by day, and then to earn the honors, they just go do a whole bunch of extra work. What has happened as a result of this is many students who have gone into the course saying, yes, I would like honors credit, the attrition rate has been tremendous. As they get very busy in their junior year, very few stick with it. And then what do you do with a student who has done all this extra work in quarter one, all this extra work in quarter two, but yet doesn't see it through? Their quarter averages have been impacted by the additional workload. So there are many strands that we've been trying to unravel. We have made adjustments to the course along the way to try to make this situation more manageable. And finally, after a lot of discussion with teachers, with the department, talking with students, came back to the idea that the course really needs to go one way or the other. It really needs to become a Regents level course or a straight honors course. An honors course should be taught at an elevated content level rather than just additional work. It actually drove students from the course. So after a lot of discussion, I mean a lot, before it even went to IPACK, a lot of conversation, the decision was made that because the majority of the students that enroll in the course are looking for Regents level credit, that we would serve the greatest number of students by keeping it at the Regents level, and that students in the 11th grade who are looking for an enhanced course would be able to take AP US History. So another offering exists at that level. We also did not want to put forward the idea that interdisciplinary studies are only for those at the honors level, as the other significant interdisciplinary course at the high school is World Cult, World Lit. So that is probably far more information than you care to have about American Studies, but I thought it warranted some sort of explanation as to why we were heading in that direction with the recommendation. It was seriously discussed at IPACK and has been all along the way, leading to this recommendation. The next course that is outlined for, and by the way, just to talk about IPACK's process, IPACK gets the agenda a week in advance. They can review all materials. It is presented by the academic leader to IPACK with any questions being answered, and then we always have at least 2 opportunities. Nobody's asked for action, much like tonight. We're making this presentation asking for board action the beginning of February, so that teachers and board members and administrators listening to this presentation have time to go back and reflect and think about this in a more broad context and ask any additional questions they may have. So you'll always note that there are 2 dates that any particular change is reviewed by IPACK, as was the case for each of these presentations. The next change is senior math. And this is following along, if you remember last year, we presented a new junior level math course. It was a refresh of what was the topics in math course. And that course is running, it's Explorations in Math. It is running this year at the junior level. The senior math is the next extension after this Explorations in Math. It is for our students who are taking 4 years of math, which we strongly encourage, and this is the pathway that provides students with the greatest amount of support as they progress through our system. Many of these students have taken algebra over 2 years, so they have taken algebra 1 as a freshman and algebra 2 as a sophomore, and then progress into this explorations leading to senior math. Our goal with senior math is to help students, and one of the ways that we're going to have an internal measure of how successful senior math is we are working right now with Hudson Valley to offer what is called the AccuPlacer, which is when you go into Hudson Valley to place into a math course, students are asked to take this exam. unless they've successfully completed upper level math courses in high school in their transcript. They go in, they take this AccuPlacer, and it determines whether or not you have enough skill to move into a credit-bearing college course. So we are hopeful that many students progressing through senior math will, using the AccuPlacer, be able to, rather than enrolling in remedial courses for math in college, be able to actually go into credit-bearing courses. But as I indicated, these the students that senior math is designed for are students who require the most support, and we will continue to monitor that. We also, for students who are not intending to go on to college after senior math, are hoping to give real-world career-building math skills, which we believe are useful for whatever career you go into. To have 4 years of math in high school is a very good thing. That was also heard by IPACK twice. And then the third adjustment is to our Spanish progressions. And we have Mrs. Sarah Chaffee with us, a world language academic administrator. And it was interesting, sometimes changes this time for reflection. Sarah entered Shen about a year and a half ago now and was hit up by many of the Spanish teachers saying, hey, we want to have a conversation about our academic progressions and why do ours not match the other 3 world languages? And Sarah said, that's a very good question. I don't know. Let me get up on my feet and figure this out. Well, teachers were just starting to raise this under the previous leadership, and they were just starting to have this conversation, and so it was fresh on their mind. And so we've been studying it for about the last year, and it is hard to explain. Why have we had a different course identification system? We actually had a different name for courses. If you're following the Spanish progression, some of these things you scratch your head like, whoever said that was good? I don't know. The equal course in Latin and German had a different title. We had some challenges when students would leave Shenendehowa to go play, say, Division I sports. We have stories, I don't know that it's folklore, of students trying to call, or the college or the coach calling our counselor saying, wait a minute, this is on the student's transcript. We don't know if this child can actually take the field for practice because it doesn't necessarily meet our naming convention as an NCAA requirement. So it led to us having this conversation about how do we get a more systematic naming convention. So part of it was our naming convention that was more recognizable and in alignment with our other world language courses. The other part of the conversation is how do we handle when students transfer into Shenendehowa, which happens often, and they come in after grade 7, which happens, but we start language in grade 7, and they have not had exposure in the states that they're coming from, or the school districts that they're coming from have not yet had exposure to language. So we traditionally have had Spanish, a few more offerings. It is the most popular language for our students to take, and therefore it's easier for us to offer additional sections. And we have had a path that operates at that next level down for students who are just entering. So the Spanish progressions, the changes that we're talking about, come up with a better naming convention and come up with a pathway that allows students entering to have a more seamless progression and still make it ideally possible that if they so choose, they could take SUNY Spanish 1, a college credit-bearing course as a senior. Students who had started Spanish earlier would have the option of having a college credit course option as both a junior and a senior. So those are the 3 major conversations that we had through IPACK this year. Please know that none of these recommendations are made lightly or without a lot of thought. We believe that these represent enhancements to the instructional program.
Could I add something, Dr. Wood? When you were talking about the Spanish progression, so if you could just add to this or clarify, the need for it is, so students are not as successful with checkpoint A. There's now multiple opportunities also, so that they don't necessarily have to go into another language. They can stay with their language of choice.
Yes.
And that was a change I thought was important. Yes.
Yeah, very good. We are providing additional opportunities for students who do not pass if they're not studying Spanish, additional opportunities for them to stay in the language that they first chose by offering remedial opportunities for them to try to be successful on checkpoint A without having to shift into Spanish where we have more level options.
Right. So that was huge.
Very good.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
these will be coming back to the board for adoption, approval. But I just wanted to give you your perspective. Kelly, can you pull up the videos? The next there? Yep. So here, you want to do the introduction as I pull the videos up?
Not yet, but yes. Sometime earlier in the year, I requested that we place on our agenda a couple of videos that I was exposed to in the process of being involved in a program called Imagine No Racism. And it was very consistent with the work we've been doing in the district in conjunction with the New York State Council of School Superintendents. So tonight we will be looking at those videos. But as further introduction, first of all, I think it's very appropriate that it happens to be the day immediately following Martin Luther King's holiday. Although when we talk about minorities, if you want to use that language, it is not confined to African Americans. It could be other groups that are not in the majority. Before individuals and groups commit to any effort, they must first recognize the existence of a problem. This evening, we will be viewing two videos. It's my hope that these videos will firmly establish the need for change and lead to a commitment to facilitate and promote positive change. Our videos relate to the problems of racism and white privilege. Relating to the solution, I want to recognize the work that Dr. Robinson has done and continues to do as a leader and part of the NICOS Commission on Diversity and Inclusivity, and also the work that he, along with Dr. Woods, has done and continues to do within a district and outside the district to promote hiring of individuals that contribute to diversity and inclusivity. I asked the board members to recall the resolution. I passed that out not because I expect you to read it, but simply as a reference because I have referred to it. So I ask you to recall the resolution authored by Dr. Robinson, promoted by Shenendehowa, and passed in October as part of the NYSBA business meeting. In district, Shenendehowa has committed itself to achieving the first two goals or objectives set forth in the resolution. Tonight's video, or videos, may be seen as part of the effort to fulfill the first objective, that is to develop and provide training focused on cultural competency and diligently promote, encourage, and facilitate access to all school boards. The third objective in the resolution calls for collaboration, a collaborative effort by the leaders of various state educational organizations to encourage, promote cultural competency, diversity, inclusivity, the training and conversation among their members and their constituents. Dr. Robinson has been actively engaged in achieving the third goal, all three actually, but the third goal, and has an update for us on what has been accomplished by the major educational organizations working collaboratively towards the common goal set forth in our resolution. Could you share that with us at this point?
Sure. So, and I'll repeat some of this and fight a bulletin as well for the board. There's been many meetings over the past several weeks and months. We started with a meeting with the Education Conference Board. So for people sitting in the audience to hear this jargon, Education Conference Board, what's that? In New York State, there are various member organizations that support education, such as the New York State Council of School Superintendent, New York State School Boards Association, New York State Union, Teachers Union, SANES, Administrative Association, all these different groups and associations come together on this board, that's under one umbrella called Education Conference Board. So several months back, I was invited to attend their meeting to talk about some of the work that my organization, the Council of School Superintendents, is doing, and very receptive, and was pleased to hear, one, not only their embrace of the notion, but some of the things that they were doing. So the Education Conference Board is very much pushing the larger agenda surrounding diversity, equity, and outcomes. NYSBA, the New York State School Boards Association, just recently sent out a new call out for presentations. They have several workshops that they plan over the course of the spring, as well as gearing up for their convention to have, again, a pretty strong presence. SANES is actually doing a workshop, and I just heard just this past week a presenter that we brought to our summer workshop in Ithaca. Dr. Shiraki Hali is actually going to be a presenter with SANES for a workshop that SANES is doing. So again, we're pleased that this organization is doing this work. New York State PTA Association just recently adopted Diversity Commission and doing a lot of work because, again, they're recognizing, they're looking around the table and seeing, one, that their school populations are pretty diverse, but the people who are engaged are not. And so how do we ensure that we're reflecting the larger perspective of the communities that we're serving becomes a big part of it. So kudos to PTA for some of those kind of things. Dr. Wood and I met with representatives from NYSET, the teachers union. And NYSET is on a significant statewide campaign to not only try to recruit teachers, but also looking at recruiting a diversity of teachers to the field of education. And again, just to elaborate the piece that Mr. DeLallo says, we live in a society that unfortunately, I say unfortunately, when you hear terms like diversity, people think that it's a black thing or it's a Hispanic thing. Diversity comes in many, many, many forms. Or when you hear things like race, again, people think that race is a black thing, Hispanic thing. We all fall into a racial category, but yet we somehow seem like there's a disconnect in some of these terms. And so when you have this conversation, you have to remind people that at the end of the day, we're all a part of some type of group, and the question is, how are we providing education in a fair and equitable way to whomever, regardless of the grouping that you're in. So we're looking at those kind of things. The Board of Regents, and I brought this newspaper article that came out on the 15th of January. The Board of Regents recently, and I've been having a lot of conversation with Regent Johnson, who's a former superintendent, Regent Odeker, who represent our region, who's also a former superintendent, two Board of Regents member, who's been really pushing the Board of Regents to say, as a state, New York State is one of the most diverse states, but yet we're one of the most segregated states. And which is a sad statement when you think about the population, because we're segregated by residential boundaries that also cross a poverty line. Maybe 2 weeks ago, Times Union ran a great story about the inequitable nature of poverty and how it's impacting the quality of life and education within the capital region. Great work that the reporter did on that piece of it. But again, the New York State Board of Regents, I've been having a lot of conversation with those two Board of Regents now coming out at a system looking at equity and outcomes. What I mean by equity and outcomes, people confuse equality and equity, two absolutely different terms. It's like tall and short. They might be measures of height, but they're absolutely different things. And so equity is not about equality. Equity is about treating differences differently. So if someone like Dr. Wood just articulated, if we need to offer more courses to hit a certain population of students, we should do so. And not say, well, we have one of each already. Well, if one of each is not being fair to certain groups of our students, we need to do more or do less. And so New York State Board of Regents is on this particular commission to do so. So a lot of work is done, and I would say kudos to NISCUS, our association. We were the forerunners and continue to be the forerunners on this. Dr. Wood and I will be presenting in Philadelphia at the National School Boards Convention in March. I was supposed to be presenting in LA for the National Superintendents Association, but I got pulled off that presentation because I can't present and run for president at the same time, to my chagrin. So the reason I'm sharing that with you is that this is something that's about how do we ensure quality experience for every kid, regardless of their zip codes. And so that's what this work is about, but we need to have real conversation as to why it's not happening. We can know what we want, but first we need to understand and acknowledge why it's not happening before we start trying to address what we ideally want.
Thank you. I have to admit that I really wasn't totally informed at just how much progress has been made, not only since October, but prior to October. It seems like we're building towards a critical mass, and that we can, we will have enough resources, enough energy, enough people committed to this effort so that we can actually move forward and make a difference. Now, the first video I want to show is called Race to Life. It's only about 5 minutes. The video does not really require...
Sorry. Kelly, come here. Can you do your thing and make it bigger and all those?
Okay. Let's start it when I...
Just fix it, Kelly.
The video does not really require a lengthy introduction. It was shown at the beginning of the business session of the most recent New York State School Boards School Boards Association convention in New York City. I found the video to be powerful and thought-provoking. Before you watch the video, carefully note the instructions given by I will call him coach, to the people who are going to be lined up, and see the response of the individuals in the video. Following the video, I'd like perhaps to take some time to discuss, at least superficially, some of the responses to the questions. Don't look at the questions until the video's been shown. Okay, thank you, Kelly.
Hey, line up! Line up! Everybody line up! We're about to race! Everybody line up! Shoulder to shoulder! Take off your backpacks! Basketball, line up! We're about to race! Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. A $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I've said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the league that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, go! If you didn't learn anything from this activity, you're a fool.
So look at the questions. What emotions, thoughts, or feelings did you experience while watching the video?
That's the second time I watched it, and that's the second time that tears were brought to my eyes because it just is real.
Yeah. It's distressing at an elemental level. What did the participants' response to the coach's instructions graphically demonstrate to the participants in the video as well as for us?
I think what you saw, facial expressions of the folks that weren't taking 2 steps forward, was sort of this loss of hope.
Yep.
You know, you sense that they started, you know, hey, you can get $100, it's up for everybody, and then you just saw the hope drain from people's faces.
I think shame too.
Yeah, because you could see them with some of them were going like this, they wanted to be seen.
You might say the fortunes of life gave some individuals, regardless of merit, certain advantages and put others at a disadvantage. How might the video help to clarify the need for specific efforts to increase diversity and inclusivity in our schools?
It encourages you to stop and take a look around, that everybody's not the same, and not everybody has the same opportunities and the same chances, and that everybody's been dealt a different hand. And even if we look the same, nobody knows what's really going on. So we have to stop and think about, hey, what about that guy? Maybe that guy's not, he hasn't had it so easy, you know, regardless of what you look like.
And helping to level the playing field as far as, you know, you talked about private tutors. There, as a school district, which I think is what you're hoping to achieve, is, you know, how can we provide the same opportunities or make kids aware that these opportunities are there for them to take advantage of. Not everyone will, but knowing that they're at a disadvantage, whoever it may be, and that it's not impossible to get there. So if it's after school, that may be impossible. If it's a tutor after school or a tutor even before school. So rethinking how we do what we do so that it is a level playing field and we have more successes than not people throwing in the towel and giving up.
I do have concern with one of the comments that the instructor or the coach said at the end, you know, when all these kids with opportunities were stepping forward, and then he made the comment near the end, he goes, I bet you, you know, if you all started on the same line, you know, some of your black fellow friends would beat you. And I'm like, but if you looked at who was in that back line, there was girls, Hispanics, there was all. So that assumption too, it's like, it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't matter what race, color, gender, whatever. Everyone has some disparity or that, you know, not that equity and opportunities, you know. So I think it's also being sensitive, not to stereotype either.
Yeah.
because, you know, there's all folks that deal with different issues. You could have families where the parents lost their jobs, you know, and they were doing fine, but now those opportunities aren't available, just assuming, again, the assumptions. So I think it's the biases that we talk about, you know, is really explored more. Like you said, you never know what your person next to you may be going through. So being a little more open-minded, you know, to be there regardless, you know.
You know, you mentioned shame too, and the people in the back feeling shame, but the people in the front should feel shame. And I mean, how could you have any pride in winning this race if you've had that big of a lead? And so in this example, everyone can see it. So those even at the front felt shame, and even though it wasn't necessary, and he made it clear, this is not something you deserved or that you did to deserve this. This is just, but they, you know, I'm sure they felt shame too. Just as the kids at the back felt, you know, it was unfair. They felt shame because this was all, they're in the back, and these are the reasons why they're in the back. Again, not anything that they did to deserve that. So it's twofold. I mean,
You know, I think we'd be foolish if we thought that everybody recognized the fact that this inequality exists.
right, yes,
There are a lot of people in denial.
yes.
And I think the video very effectively conveys the legitimacy of the inequality that exists. And that would be my hope, that when other school boards are exposed to similar types of things, even if it wasn't this, that it would create a realization that there is a need to address the inequality, that by promoting diversity and inclusivity, we are helping to address that fundamental difference and trying to negate some of the negativity that comes out of what already exists.
I think that's
I think
a great idea, but I also think that it's important to acknowledge that people come with their own set of feelings about things.
Oh, yeah.
And so when you're faced with that and then you show something like this,
Yeah.
everybody can agree, but then people still have to grapple with what their own issues
Right.
are. So I think that's where the problem lies, that you have to get over that hurdle to get to the to get to where we're all one.
To have a conversation.
Right.
But unfortunately, this is where I'll be the devil's advocate and be the jaded person in life, because I can be jaded. But you're going to get, I think the students, they get it, they see that. It's adults like us. I've heard this in other conversations through where I work, is where you have adults going, well, it's not my fault I've done well in life and gave my kids those opportunities, you know, so I have nothing to apologize for. Or, you know, you have that where they're like, not my problem. You know, I've been able to. So it's also overcoming some of those, I don't know what it is, ignorance, educating people, you know, what it truly means. But I think you'll find that, unfortunately, I'm not condoning
It's like
that, but I'm saying
internalized racism or homophobia, whatever your
People
issue
find
is, that
reasons,
it's needing to acknowledge it and to then move forward.
Right.
Yeah, isn't that what the second video kind of focuses on?
There is a second video, and I want to move on to it. Yeah. The second video is much longer. It also is one where I think that there will be more division, you might say, or variety of response to it. It's perhaps more controversial. So this is what I said in connection with it. Some terms used in the video are in common usage, but have no consistent definition. That is, we don't agree on the definition. The use of some terms may be, in fact, divisive, elicit even negative responses, or cause stress. Therefore, please accept Dr. D'Angelo's, and that's the narrator, Dr. D'Angelo's definition, at least while viewing the video, for common understanding. We have to have a common vocabulary. Some statements may be challenging and initially hard to accept. We may not accept all of them at any point. Try not to dwell on individual statements and think about what your reaction to it is, but but stay with the presentation. Instead, continue to focus on what she's saying. And then there were certain terms that I felt were particularly important that we come away with an understanding of. And these, I don't believe, are as controversial. Implicit bias, explicit bias, cultural racism, and structural racism. And there are 7 questions, and I don't think we'll probably discuss all of them, but they're worth thinking about. And beside that, on our agenda, there is the name of those videos, and I would suggest that it would be a good thing to go back and look at them after the meeting at some point. I think I've seen this second video at least 7 times, and you know, I get something out of it every time. Okay, go ahead, Kevin. This is about 25 minutes. Sorry about that.
I'm Dr. Robin D'Angelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless? It is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today, I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference, and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces the system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men. I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power. And so prior to the civil rights movement, it was fairly socially acceptable for white people to just come out and say, we are superior. My father certainly was comfortable saying that. The great joke of Archie Bunker and all of the family was that he wasn't up with the times and he was still saying things that conveyed this idea. But post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist, right? It became unacceptable to be racist. And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism's bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue. In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity and how it shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives, I've had a very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script, right? Like it's almost as if, as white folks, we just pick up the script and we say the same things again and again and again. And as a sociologist, rather than seeing something that's patterned as meaning therefore it's true, I look at something patterned as very revealing of how we get socialized to see things and to see the world. And then the next question that follows that is, and so how does that function, right? And when we look around us, we can see that although we have changes since the civil rights movement and we have this idea of racism being bad, we still have the same unequal outcomes by race. By every measure, we have racial inequality. So how do we have such different narratives than we had prior to the civil rights movement and still have unequal outcomes? And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself. I don't see color, I was taught to treat everybody the same, I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted, my parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist, or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it, the answer is always, I'm not racist, I know people of color, I used to work in the military. All of the things we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now, I want to speak to two of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I'm just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. Right? And that's why I have this image of a dock, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water, you see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface. Okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color, okay? And so we're giving you evidence, right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same. But we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences, because racism is real. And while race isn't real, in other words, at the biological level, there is no real, true race or racial difference as we're taught to understand it, these very superficial signifiers of racial difference that allow us to categorize people, these are very real in their consequences for people's lives. And this insistence that we're all one doesn't allow us to engage with that social reality. I try to help white people see how race functions in our lives. And I try to move us away from the really obvious, evident examples, such as a racist joke or a racist action, or things that would be recognizable to everybody, right? The kinds of acts that cause people like me, well-meaning people like me, to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. And I try to help white people understand racism as the very fabric of our society. And I think the most profound example of everyday racism is segregation. That most white people live in racial segregation. While we may work with people of color, when we go home, people of color are rarely at our dinner table. And I don't mean setting our table. I mean sitting and breaking bread with us, true relationships in our lives. Many people can recognize the explicit, kind of conscious dislike type of racism, racist jokes, racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to I want to help white people see the everyday racism that's embedded and that we participate in. And I want to look at neighborhood and school segregation as an example. I'm going to start with this app here. These are the app's founders. It's a new app called The Sketch Factor. And what it does is when you go to a new city, you can put in where you are, and it tells you which neighborhoods to avoid because they're sketchy. And of course, sketchy is very much associated with race and class in the white mind. And so now we have the convenience of segregation through an app. We don't actually have to talk to other white people about, where are the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods. And that good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, good schools, bad schools discourse is an example of new racism. I don't think it gets by anybody that is racially coded language. So this way we can come out and police those racial boundaries without ever kind of naming race. But we all know what we're talking about. And I think the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is through the power of segregation. Most white people do live in segregation. We choose that segregation. And in a lot of ways, we celebrate it. What makes a school good and what makes a neighborhood good? Well, the absence of people of color. That is the way that white people measure the value of their neighborhoods and schools. And while we don't come out and name that, we all know what it is. And so I have had to think very deeply on what it means to have grown up in a primarily white neighborhood, to be born into, to go to school, to study, to learn, to play, to worship, to love, to work, and to die in segregation, and not have one single person who loved, mentored, or guided me convey that there was any loss. And I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very profound, and I really want us to sit that I could live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I followed the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me, in my good neighborhood, and my good school, and my good college, and my good career, in which I would ideally rise to the top, I could easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color, and not one person who guided me ever conveyed that there was loss. Just sit with that for a moment, that there is no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. If my parents, if my schools, if my curriculum, if my teachers, if my government saw value in those perspectives, I would be given those perspectives, but I wasn't given those perspectives. And that shapes my relationships. It shapes what I care about. It shapes what I see, what I don't see, who I build my life with, and who I don't build my life with. That is the level where we really need to look at race inside of us and with us. In the line of work that I do, it's a breakthrough if you can get white people to acknowledge that our race privileges us in this society, right? That is like the second coming, to get white folks to admit that we are privileged by our race. But even that begins to get superficial. And you'll hear white people say, just because of the color of my skin, you know, I have these things, as if this is just an accident that happens. And I want to take us deeper. I want to take us inside this skin. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. That is what I call this system. I don't mean the KKK. I mean a system in which whiteness and white people are central and seen as inherently superior than to people of color. My personality was formed in that water. My worldview was formed in that water. I didn't choose it. It isn't my fault. I'm not racked with guilt about it, but I am responsible for changing it, because the default of our society is the reproduction of racism. It's built into every system and every institution. And if we just live our lives and carry on in the most comfortable ways for us, we will necessarily reproduce it. There is no neutral space. Inaction is a form of action. One of the most effective adaptations of racism since the civil rights era is this idea of a racist is a bad person, and if you're not racist, you're a good person. What I call the good-bad binary. And we can all fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then you're prejudiced and mean-spirited and bigoted and ignorant and Southern and probably drive a pickup truck. So we got some classism in there, right? This is our racist. And if you're not racist, you're good and you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're educated and you're northern. And this binary is probably the number one construct that keeps racism today in place and makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. The defensiveness we have comes from this binary. What we hear is, you just said I was a bad person. And so this binary sets it up to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a good person and be complicit with racism. So you'll notice in the news when racism gets talked about, they'll bring in the evidence they'll have to defend the person that's being accused of racism is, but he's a really nice person, right? Because again, it's mutually exclusive. We have to understand racism as a system that we're all a part of. You know, I often, in my trainings, after I kind of laid out how racism works, I'll ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our inevitable, unaware and unintentional, but inevitable racism, and have that go well for you? And, you know, there's eye rolls and laughter, and basically the answer is never. Right? It's virtually impossible for people of color to give us feedback, because that binary sets us up to defend, right? I must, at all costs, deflect and establish that I am not racist, right? And that makes it so that we can't examine the reality of the society that we live in. And then I'll follow up and ask this question. So what would your daily life be like This is a question I ask the people of color. If you could simply give us feedback when we step in it, which we inevitably will, and have us receive that with grace, reflect, and seek to do something different, what would your daily life be like? And recently, a man of color in the room, there was a pause, and then he said, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Revolutionary. That white people would receive the feedback, reflect, and try to change our behavior. That would be a revolution. And on the one hand, it speaks to how difficult we are, how powerful this binary is to keep us separate, from this system in our minds, but also how simple. And that there are material consequences, right, in heart rate and blood pressure and length of life for people of color, from the ways that would lower the kinds of stress that they have every day, navigating all of this from us while we deny that anything's happening. Returning to the pillars underneath the dock, now we can label them, right? So we have individualism, we have universalism, right? Individualism, why can't we all be different? Universalism, why can't we all be the same? They both function to take race off the table. We have internalized superiority that no white person can miss. It was not lost on me that fundamentally it is better to be white. I don't want that belief. I didn't ask for that belief, and I've committed my life to challenging it. But 24/7, that is what society reinforces for me. So internalized superiority is also one of the pillars. The good-bad binary is a very foundational pillar of holding up new racism. And segregation, the power of segregation to keep this system in place. And for me, by identifying those pillars, it has helped guide me to then how would I challenge each of those things. And so I urge you to take this journey. It is lifelong. It won't be over in my lifetime. I will never be free of all of the investments in this system that I have that I can't see, but I have committed my life to doing my very best to continually challenge it. And I invite you, and in fact, urge you to do the same.
Okay, I warned you. It can be challenging. I certainly don't expect to discuss all 7 of those questions. I very quickly just decided maybe we could at least look at 3 of them. And the second, third, and fourth ones would be the ones that I would like to possibly talk about. If we simply maintain the status quo in terms of diversity and inclusivity, what message is being sent to our students, both white and of color?
I think what we're doing is we're sort of we're just maintaining a plateau. We're not challenging ourselves. What I got from the video is that people need to challenge it. It's been this way for probably since I first became aware of it in elementary school. And I have not seen anything really change. I see sometimes people talk about it more, but then the pendulum switches back to the old way. And no one really is deeply challenging.
I think one of the statements, and she repeated it, that I felt really resonated with me, is that if our students, regardless of whether they're black or of color, that is, or white, do not see people like them or different from them, then they're getting a message. If you never interact with people of color, subtly that's telling us, oh, well, we really don't need to. What's the point of dealing or interacting with this group of people? They have nothing of value to offer us. That's a very powerful statement. And look at it conversely through the eyes of someone who is of color. Says, they're receiving the message that I'm not worthwhile. So it becomes very important to us, for all of our students, whether of color or white, that we promote diversity and give the students an opportunity to interact and see. I'm not saying it's going to do away with this implicit bias and the kind of racism that she was talking about. Certainly make inroads, but at least we'll value one another and recognize the value of one another. Who will benefit from our efforts to create diversity in our school district? I think actually I already answered it.
Future.
I think everybody.
Students are our future, yeah.
I think everybody. While we may not be able to eradicate racism, even within ourselves, what can we do within ourselves and within our schools to counter racism?
I think one thing you can do is you establish a standard of expectation of what not to do, what's not acceptable. I think you can do that. You can say it's not acceptable to do certain things. I think, throughout my years, it's been pretty obvious what some of those are. Which you can go further is you might be able to have discussions about why they're not acceptable. And maybe there's a history there, maybe you bring that forward, but I think that's a very challenging thing to do. You want to do it right. You cannot sort of throw a switch and say it's all taken care of. I think that's one of the problems we've had over the years. I think she was sort of pointing to that. And you have to say, no, this is deeply ingrained into things that probably have gone on in your brain, but you have not been aware of.
And I think to our Day of Dialogues, I think that's a wonderful initiative that we have, where you bring in students, where you're giving them the opportunity, engaging them in embracing the differences, but learning about the differences. Why does a certain student feel a certain way? Or what do they think that they're not given the opportunity to do? And I think the students learning from that, but it's also staff, that are hearing more about that, doing more of that, but also sharing out, some of the experiences from that and having some of these students that are participating, bringing in new groups, bringing them in. I think that's very key. Again, you're learning what the differences are about, or you might have a misunderstanding, of what, I don't want to approach and try to, get to know this person because they might be offended that I'm trying too hard to make them feel included. There's also that, I think, obstacles that we put in our own mind of why we won't reach out to get to know other people with differences too.
I think the overt and explicit bias is relatively easy to recognize and also to address, because you see it. But the implicit stuff that's operating within, unless we are aware of the fact that those things are operating in us, then we haven't got a clue and we haven't got a hope.
Yep.
So to me, the educational process of making people aware of that implicit factor operating in us so that we will be conscious and reflective about these things. And when we see them in ourselves, then we will try to do something about it. But if we don't see it, it's not going to happen. So without education along those lines, it just goes on and on. And quite frankly, each generation, unless we can do something on a societal level so that the socialization process modifies too, we're fighting this battle every generation, every individual.
It happens so frequently in everything that we do. It's so to be aware, you have to change. You have to do something. Like she said several times, inaction is an action. And so in some capacity, so it's to move forward, we have to stop. We have to regroup. We have to rethink how we've been doing things. Because to keep moving forward is, that's almost what was hard about watching this video. It was everything that we do is not what we think it is. Everything that we say we're doing, that we categorize as progress, is not progress. So I feel that the message where we're going with this is that we have to take a step back and revisit how we do everything. And I'm not even sure where to start. It's somewhat overwhelming.
I think it's important to acknowledge that it has to be acknowledged. And I also think that sometimes it's a dirty word and people don't want to talk about it. And then if you start there, then maybe a conversation can come from there. That, you know, this is something that makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But let's talk about it anyway. It's okay, and maybe your feelings will be hurt, and maybe you won't like what we have to say. But let's just have a conversation.
And have rules so that, okay, my feelings are hurt, but I'm not going to react.
Or that
say,
you know what, maybe I will react, but maybe it's just part of who I am, and maybe I'll learn something from this, that I don't always have to react, or maybe it's not directed necessarily at me, but, you know, it's a way to move out of it, and to move forward.
Yeah.
I think the dialogue continues, and we
Yeah.
have to give a lot of thought, and our efforts need to be sustained.
You know, even with the Day of Dialogue, so since you brought that one up, the interesting thing about the Day of Dialogue is that most of the presenters in the room are white. So even with that, there's an opportunity for change. Are they, we're talking color. It's also interesting when you refer to someone, when someone's telling me a story and they say, so-and-so, oh, a black person, and I'm thinking, do you identify every white person in your conversation as, oh, my friend Naomi, the white person, or the white lady? It would be offensive if somebody referred to me that way in a conversation, but you hear it. And so just breaking this down, getting it out there, like you said, processing it and moving forward, trying to do, you know, with the intention of doing it differently, realizing that we can't go back. It's there, it's out there.
And also getting back to the point too, of diversity, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it's beyond just racism and about race. Again,
Right.
It's about kids that may have disabilities, again, not labeling, but just saying kids have disabilities maybe, you know, gender identity.
Religion, everything.
There's
Yeah.
so many, we all, like we said, have differences, we just categorize it differently, or it's not, like I said, emphasized as much, so remembering that it's so much more, you know, that we really look at.
I want to thank Dr. Robinson for giving me the opportunity to present this to the board, and for you bearing with me, because it was a little bit longer than our typical presentation. But I also appreciate the fact that the dialogue, the interchange of thoughts, and so, you know, it wasn't superficial. It was, people were really thinking about what they were saying and what they were doing.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Robinson would like to make
Just, first of all, Mr. DeLello, thank you very much, and thank you as a board. It's interesting. I can guarantee you there aren't too many boards of education that's having very thoughtful conversation around how we function as a society of people. And even kudos to even the public library here, who's going to have, how do you talk about race? And I just, not to prolong this couple, too much, but a few points I want to make, you know, that as a system, we talk about equity and outcomes. And sometimes when you use terms of often, people kind of like, you know, it's kind of like the everyday term, people take for granted what does that actually mean. And so we could talk about we want equity and outcomes, but what are we actually doing? You know, I'm thinking of a couple different things as I look out in the audience. Just met with Mr. Meir the other day. He and I were talking about looking at discipline data. We're looking at disproportionality in discipline. Somebody say, well, you know, we only suspended 10 Hispanic kids this year, but if there's only 15 of them, disproportionality is huge. But yet we look at the pure number and we justify, rationalize certain things. When we look at student performance, and we see within buildings, there's certain students from certain subgroups, as we break different groups of kids down, that have never been successful. But yet people rationalize, well, it's only a handful. And so a big part of then, back to what we have to do is come to terms of Really, suppose that was you. Would you want that outcome? Oh, well, you probably can't even imagine having that outcome. So that's where it first starts. Just imagine if you was you then. And then would you want that outcome? So we talk about those kind of things, or the recent work that Kathleen Stranderson and Dr. Wood's office is offering, the whole idea of we have kids who go through 13 years and never read a book that reflect anything about their culture, their race. 13 years, think about that. And in a system that educating, who are we educating kids about? About everyone else, and so therefore, where do I stand? And so we talk about things like the mirrors in windows. When you have kids see mirrors of themselves and then windows to a wider world. So when Cameron goes to college, he's not walking on the campus like, oh my God, I've never interacted with someone like this before, versus, yeah, I've interacted with many people, and I embrace the differences. I want to understand, and I want you to understand me. And so we think about those kind of things. And so we have to think as a board, what are the policies that perpetuate that structural racism? And racism, again, cuts across everyone. And that's why I love her thing. White people have a tendency to say that I don't have a race. Okay, race belongs to everyone else. So what are you? And so I think her point is very well taken, and your point, Mrs. Hoffman, hit the nail on the head. I laugh all the time when people say that to me, like, oh yeah, well, so what about all other people? You want to identify what their race is too? Which kind of shows the mindset that people have, and that's the reason why we never really intentionally interrupt things that we know we're not satisfied with the outcomes, because we fall into this trap of comfort. What's good for me and most of mine, everyone else has to assimilate to that. Versus the reality of it is, we have a society that's made up of wide variety and fabric, and how do we embrace it? But never as much as we think in our head and rationalize it to be. So, Gary, thank you very much for doing this, and I appreciate it, and I think this it shows that what kind of school community we are trying to foster every day.
Can I ask a question? I said, Cameron, not to put it on the spot, but do you have any thoughts, like, on any of this as a student? I'm just curious, and again, if you don't have anything right now, it's okay.
Yeah, I think it's great that the board's having these discussions. I'm lucky to get to work with the World Difference Club through school, and we get to go to middle school and have similar types of discussions. So.
That's great, good. I didn't even know that. Thank you for being involved as well.
Okay, any other comments, thoughts? Okay, good, great discussion. Let's go to action items, acceptance of shared decision-making plan. So this is something we talked about earlier. Go ahead, Mrs. Miller.
I was
Motion, okay, second. Mrs. Rajat, okay, any other comments on this one? If not, all in favor? Okay. And at this point, we're ready to adjourn. Any other final thoughts and comments? If not, can I have a motion to adjourn? Mrs. Hoffman, second. Mrs. Miller, all in favor? All in favor? Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very good.